Hey guys, here's something I want you to think about before we even get started on this. Somewhere in your town, maybe it's a school, maybe it's a library, maybe it's a rec center, there's a building named after somebody. And I'd be willing to bet that if you stepped, I don't know, were you outside and stopped 10 people in the street and asked them who that person was, maybe two of them could tell you. And I'd bet that if you pressed those two, at least one of them would have no idea why that particular name ended up on that particular building. Names on buildings are kind of weird that way. They feel sort of permanent. They feel intentional. They feel like they mean something. And sometimes they do, but sometimes a name just gets put on a wall because somebody was famous at exactly the right moment, and the moment passed, and now the name is just, there, carved in stone, outlasting the story that put it there, and no one knows why. Well, today we're talking about one of those names. And, as we tend to do a lot of times, we're going to go to Selma. This is JoCoYo, and this is the story of a man named Richard Barry Harrison, a school in Selma, and the question of how a Canadian-born actor who never set foot in Johnston County ended up with his name on the most important building in the black community for 40 years. Let's get going. We're going to start in 1933. On February 4th of that year, the school building serving Selma's African American children caught fire and burned to the ground. The building had been a hand-me-down, literally. It was a frame schoolhouse that had originally served white students, then been moved south of the railroad tracks and handed over to the black community when white students got a new building. That's how separate but equal worked in practice. You got the leftovers, and now the leftovers had burned. The site that was occupied by what would become Harrison School had served as a hub for African American public education from the late 19th century into the 1980s. So this wasn't a new community. This was a community that had been educating its children on that ground since 1880, and they now had to start over. Now, what followed was a piece of New Deal history that doesn't really get told enough. The burned building was replaced in 1935 by a three-story brick building constructed by the Civil Works Administration and the Emergency Relief Administration of North Carolina. Government money, federal money. Depression-era public works. The same programs that were building courthouses and post offices and bridges across the country were building a school for black children in Selma, North Carolina. And when they built it, they gave it a name, and they called it the Richard B. Harrison School. So who was Richard B. Harrison? Okay. Richard Barry Harrison was born in London, Ontario, Canada on September 28, 1864, to parents who had escaped slavery in the United States. His parents had come north through the Underground Railroad. His mother named him Richard after seeing a performance of Shakespeare's Richard III. Her love of theater, handed down to her son, would define the next 70 years of his life. When his father died in 1881, Harrison became the main provider for his family at age 17. He moved to Detroit to work at the Russell House Hotel, and while in Detroit, Harrison met Chambliss Hull, a theater manager who arranged for him to study at the Detroit Training School of Art. He graduated in 1887, and then he went looking for work as an actor. But they wouldn't hire him because of his race. That's documented. So Harrison did what artists do when the door is shut. He went around it. He built a one-man show, developed a program of dramatic readings, Shakespeare, American poets, English poets, and he started touring the United States, Canada, eventually Mexico. For decades, he was a working artist doing dramatic readings for black audiences in black venues in a country that had decided he was not allowed on its main stages. If you can't perform, read the stuff. By 1913, he performed at the first black-owned theater, the Pekin, in Chicago. He was getting older, he was getting more accomplished, and the main stage was still close to him. Then in 1922, something shifted. Harrison had a nervous breakdown. Decades of constant travel, constant performance pressure, constant scrambling for money had finally caught up with him, and in that low moment, a door opened. After convincing the president of North Carolina A&T, James B. Dudley, of the need for a dramatic program of study, he began to offer summer courses there in 1922. He came to North Carolina. He set up a drama department at NCA&T in Greensboro, and for 7 years he taught elocution and dramatics to black students who had nowhere else to go to learn those things. The enrollment grew from 17 students to over 200. He gave that state 7 years of his career. Then in 1929, a phone call came. A Broadway play called The Green Pastures needed a lead actor. The role was Dalald, God, portrayed as a country preacher from the rural American South, in an all-black retelling of the Old Testament. Harrison was 65 years old, he'd never had a major Broadway role, and he almost didn't take this one. He knew that black actors were often asked to play unintelligent, irresponsible clowns at the time period, and it was not a stereotype he was going to propagate. He had spent 40 years building a career on dignity and craft, and he was not going to throw that away for a part that made black people a punchline. There was way too much of that. But he read it, he thought about it, and he said, you know what? Yeah, I'll do it. The Green Pastures opened on Broadway on February 26, 1930, the first production in Broadway history with an all-black cast. That had never happened before. And Harrison, at 65, in his first major stage role, he became a star. He played Dalald for more than 1,650 performances. He never missed a single one. The show ran for 16 months on Broadway, then went on a national tour that hit over 200 cities. The NAACP, which had initially opposed Harrison taking the role because they feared it would be demeaning, reversed course and awarded him their highest honor, the Spingarn Medal, in 1931. On his 17th birthday in 1934, he received congratulatory telegrams from 14 college and university presidents and 7 state governors. He's a star. Time magazine featured Harrison on its cover on March 4th, 1935, just 10 days before his death. 10 days. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and 10 days later he was gone. He collapsed before a matinee performance in New York City and died of heart failure. 15,000 people of all backgrounds came to pay their respects at Harrison's home the night before the funeral services. Now, back to Selma. Back to 1935. Back to a community building, a new school with New Deal money on the site where their old one had burned. You're in Selma, North Carolina. You're black. It's Jim Crow. Your children are required by law to attend separate schools. These schools are funded at a fraction of what white schools receive. The last school was a hand-me-down. The state of North Carolina spends considerably more per pupil on white children than on black children. You are building something out of nothing again because the last one burned and you need a name. The school was named for Richard Berry Harrison, who appeared in the play The Green Pastures and who taught drama classes at NCA&T. That second part is the key. Harrison wasn't just famous, he was famous and he was now North Carolina's. He had spent 7 years in Greensboro. He had trained hundreds of black students who might never have had the chance to study the dramatic arts otherwise. Doors were closed. He had a connection to this state that made his name mean something here in the way it didn't in, say, Mississippi and Texas. Then he died in March 1935 with his face on the cover of Time magazine again. The most celebrated black man in America and the community of Selma was naming a school the very same year. That ain't a coincidence. That's a community paying tribute while the tribute still meant something, while the name was still warm. Now I want to take a step back because what happened in Selma was part of a much bigger pattern across the entire Jim Crow South, and it's a pattern worth understanding. When black communities named their schools, they were doing something political. In a world where almost every institution, every street, every county bore the name of someone white, often someone who had enslaved people, or someone who was actively working to keep black Americans from voting and learning and living freely, putting a black name on a black school, that ain't coincidence, man. That is an act of assertion. And you'd see the names, the same names over and over: Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Paul Laurence Dunbar, George Washington Carver. These weren't just names, they're a curriculum, man. When overcrowding forced Kansas City to convert all white schools to schools for black students, the district renamed schools after black luminaries such as Benjamin Banneker and Booker T. Washington as a code for the race of the students and the neighborhood that the school served. You're making a statement, a code. The name on the building told you who was inside, but it also told those students, here are people who look like you, who came from similar backgrounds, and who did extraordinary things. Frederick Douglass never taught in your town. Booker T. Washington never walked your streets, but his name on your school says something to you that every morning when you walk through that door. D.C.'s Dunbar High School was renamed in 1916 for the noted African-American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who died in 1906, 10 years earlier, and with no particular connection to Washington. He was from Dayton, Ohio. He'd never lived in D.C., but his name on that building, which became one of the finest academic high schools in the country, sending 80% of its students to college, told those students who they were supposed to aspire to. The names were aspirational. They were political. They were geographic resistance in a way that they could. And then there's the other side, because here's where it also gets kind of complicated. And this is part of the story that makes Richard B. Harrison's name on a school in Selma particularly interesting. See, Harrison, by the end of his life, was controversial. Not because of anything he did wrong, but because of a choice he made that put principle against politics in a way that still doesn't have an easy answer. When the Green Pastures went on its national tour, it was scheduled to open in Washington, D.C. at the National Theater, which was segregated. Black people could not attend. The cast that Harrison led, an all-black cast, would perform for white-only audiences. An all-black cast could not perform for even a single black witness, only white audiences. Harrison received pressure to boycott the performance by influential members of politics, literature, and scholarship, and by organizations such as the NAACP, refusing to make his art an instrument of politics. Harrison performed as scheduled, despite threats of physical violence against him and the cast. He walked into that segregated theater. He played God for a white audience that would not have allowed him to sit beside them. And he did it because he believed that art had to exist independent of politics, or it would be weaponized by politics, even if it were the right side. Now, you can argue about that decision for a long time. Many people did. Many people still would. But here's what I find remarkable. The community in Selma chose to put that man's name on a school for black children in a segregated school system. A man who had taught in North Carolina, a man who was the most famous black American of his moment, a man who was complex and human, and who had made a choice that reasonable people disagreed with, and they claimed him anyway. Richard B. Harrison's school served the African American students of Johnston County until the school system was integrated in 1970. Harrison School closed in 1987. 52 years. 2 generations of students walked through those doors under that name. They played on that baseball field. They learned bricklaying in that agricultural building. In the late 1930s, state officials lauded the progress made by Johnston County in regards to its African American schools, singling out the county for its program of consolidation of elementary and high schools. By the mid-1950s, the school had grown from a 25-teacher school to one with 45 teachers in just 10 years. The 1935 building, the original New Deal building, the one they named for Harrison, it was demolished in 1995. It's gone. But in 2012, the school was renovated and transformed into the Harrison Center for Active Aging, the largest multi-purpose senior center in Johnston County. The name is still there. Richard Berry Harrison never set foot in Johnston County, never drove down Highway 301, never saw Selma. He was Canadian. He was a Canadian-born son of escaped slaves who spent 40 years doing dramatic readings in places that wouldn't let him on the main stage. Then spent 7 years teaching drama in Greensboro, then became nationally famous at 65 and died at 70 with his face on a magazine cover and 15,000 strangers standing outside his door to say goodbye. And a community in Selma North Carolina, in the middle of Jim Crow, building a school out of federal money on ground where their last school had burned, looked at all of that and said, that's who we want our kids to walk towards every morning. That ain't a bad question. Well, that's not a bad answer to the question of why. Now, if you want to dig deeper on Richard B. Harrison, there's a full biography, DeLaw, Richard B. Harrison and the Green Pastures by Walter C. Daniel, and the New York Public Library Schomburg Center holds his personal collection, letters, playbills, scrapbooks, a biography draft written by someone who knew him. The Johnston County Heritage Center in Smithfield holds the Harrison School NRHP nomination and photographs. The Harrison Center for Active Aging is on West Noble Street in Selma, right where it's always been. The name is still in the building. Go read it. And y'all, that's JoCoYo. Be good.